Hello and welcome to South to North, coming to you from Johannesburg. We are running out of places to bury it. It's getting too toxic to burn it, and we're not even good at recycling it. Yet it's a huge part of our lives. If you're poor, you may have to live with it. If you're lucky enough to be well off, you'll pay other people to get rid of it for you. Yes, I'm talking about waste, our junk, garbage, trash, whatever you want to call it. And it's becoming a huge problem for all of us wherever we live. If we don't do something about it, we risk sinking into our own waste. Today on the show, we have waste sector specialist Melanie Sampson explaining the expansion of waste pickers all over the world, and environmental capitalist Jason Drew on how he's turned biodegradable waste into high-protein animal feed. But first, I'd like to welcome Cecilia Njenga, the head of the United Nations Environmental Programme in Pretoria, who can give us a better idea of the current state of waste management around the world. Welcome, Cecilia. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
The United Nations Environmental Programme works with all levels of waste management. Is this something that we need to be concerned about?
Waste management is increasingly becoming one of the greatest challenges, particularly for a highly urbanizing world. We know that 60% of the entire world population in the next few years will be living in urban areas. We do also know that a lot of the waste that is generated is basically, and we are talking about organic waste here, is basically generated in our urban areas. In most of our cities, particularly in Africa, we are increasingly seeing municipalities not having the capacity to manage this waste. A lot of the waste is being strewn along the roadsides. We are seeing it in dump sites. We are seeing health effects of this waste affecting our children here in Africa, as well as we are seeing increasingly, particularly clean water being affected by the seepage of pollutants.
Should we be concerned, Cecilia, about the amount of waste generated as a result of urbanization and many other factors, including heightened economic activity? Is it the amount or the management thereof?
It's a two-way thing. As countries industrialize, there are technologies now, there is human capacity and technologies that are being introduced for cleaner production. So on the industrial side, there are opportunities to have much more cleaner production.
It would seem that some African countries are actually the dumping ground for toxic waste from increased industrialization and other parts of the world.
That's very true. Increasingly, we are seeing, particularly the whole issue, electronic waste particularly, seeing a lot of it landing in Africa, and we having no capacity here in Africa to deal with it and in how to dispose of it.
Are we getting money in exchange for being a dumping ground?
I believe we are not. I don't think we are getting money, but we are being attracted by the way development is growing to be attracted to these kind of goods, whether you're talking about motor vehicles, whether you're talking about electronic goods, mobile phones. I mean, a lot of us here in Africa now, the uptake of mobile phones has been, very, very, too much. A lot of people have 2 to 3 mobile telephones, 3 to 4 chargers, a lot of times just lying around and not knowing how to dispose this.
And we don't think of it as waste. It's just something that's
waste.
Just lying around in your drawer. We need a paradigm shift, obviously.
We definitely do need a paradigm shift, because as soon as we start seeing our waste disposal sites being choked by these electronic wastes and the toxic effects that these has on ourselves and our bodies, we will have to wake up, and we don't really have to wait for that moment.
What are the implications of not waking up and taking waste management and the presence of waste as urgently as we need to take it?
We need to take some urgent action. It will have extremely harmful effects, not to us as human beings. It will have harmful effects. It will affect our water quality. It will affect the food quality, etc. So it really has a wholesome effect if we don't take cognizance of the fact right now. For instance, in Copenhagen, that's in Denmark, only 3% of the waste gets into their dumping yards. They are able to deal with their waste in a very efficient manner and ensure that they allocate very small land for landfill. They don't need the landfills.
For a poorer nation, perhaps the concerns are about creating jobs and feeding your children, taking them to school. But this is a multi-billion-dollar industry. So obviously we challenge to think of waste differently. New industries can grow out of that. What are your thoughts?
Yes, indeed. The waste sector globally is a multi-million-dollar sector. And the countries and entrepreneurs who have found, a way in it, and they're making millions of money around it. Around Africa, in the countries particularly where I have worked, I have seen small-scale entrepreneurship, innovations taking place. We have seen people transforming waste paper into poles that they can use for fencing, etc. So we are seeing some incremental entrepreneurship spirit building around the whole area of waste around Africa. We are also seeing a lot of other bigger initiatives like waste to energy, where you're able to transform the waste into an energy source that you can feed into the grid or supply your plant or supply a certain community. So it's indeed, there are great opportunities around waste.
I was astounded, and I mean, we are trying to challenge families, to challenge all of us to think differently about waste, the waste that we generate in our own homes. I was astounded when I read that at least a third of the world's food production, perfectly edible food, goes to waste. I mean, how do we justify that in a world that is so full of hungry and poor people?
It's difficult to actually justify. When again, the other side of the coin, we are technologically innovating. So we do have the technology that would also allow us not to waste. But we are looking at the entire food supply chain at the moment, and we are seeing tremendous waste. For Africa, actually for us, is about food loss. A lot of the waste we have is not really at the consumer side, because we are seeing the food waste for an average African person or person from Asia, Southeast Asia, is 9 to 11 kilos per person per year, whereas in the north is about 95 to 100 kilograms of wasted food per year. For Africa, a lot of our food loss is happening at the planting stage. A lot of our crops are attacked by insects or other creatures, and therefore, what you plant is not what you sow. And therefore, a lot of, during harvesting, the technology perhaps we use for harvesting causes a lot of waste. During storage, the technologies that we are using are rudimentary, and therefore, at the end of 1 month or 2 months, you can go back to your storage and find that the food has rotted or etc. So a lot of the food waste that's happening in Africa is really during the production stage. And in the northern part of our world, a lot of food waste is happening really at the retailer and at the consumer. I mean, let's take, for instance, all the food is being labeled expiring by the 10th of June. As soon as you see that date, and it is the 8th of June, you throw it away.
I'm actually sitting here cringing because that's exactly what I do in my home as well. You see the expiry date and you think, should I, shouldn't I? You try to smell the food. It hasn't gone off, but because the date says something else, you're throwing it away. That is waste.
Exactly. Let's not look at the color.
I read somewhere that the concern for the world is how beautiful the food is and the aesthetics of it all, but waste should be the fundamental concern. Well, our next guest feels very strongly about changing attitudes. She's going to tell us more about it. Dr. Melanie Sampson examines how societies informally deal with waste. She's the Africa Waste Sector Specialist for an NGO called WAGO and a postdoctoral fellow at the Public Affairs Research Institute. Welcome, Melanie. Welcome. Have a seat. It's lovely to have you with us.
Thank you.
Melanie, let's start with our definitions. They're called waste pickers, but I understand you prefer the term reclaimers. Tell me about that.
Well, in English, many policymakers and movements of people who do this work around the world call themselves waste pickers. But the naming of people who do this work is a political issue. In Brazil, the people who do this work call themselves collectors of reusable and recyclable material. In most of Spanish-speaking Latin America, they call themselves recyclers. And the reason why they've chosen these terms is because they want to emphasize that they're not just picking through waste. They are searching for valuable materials, and they're actually retrieving things of value from the waste.
How do they avoid the stigma associated with their work, where they're even regarded as scavengers?
So the stigma is something that can't be avoided. It's something that has to be confronted. Virtually every society has some kind of taboo about dealing with waste and dirt. And people who take on this work have to confront that. They also have to confront it within themselves. I've spent a year working with reclaimers on a garbage dump in Soweto. And one of the things I spent a lot of time talking to them about is, what does it mean to become a reclaimer? And these are people, many of them are very well educated, but who have either been pushed out of formal employment or can't find a job because of the massive levels of unemployment in South Africa and across the developing world. And so many of them heard that you could make money on a garbage dump, and they came. But at first they were repulsed. They thought, I don't want to be someone who goes through garbage. But as they came back day after day, they saw how much money people were making and the valuable work that they were doing. So reclaimers need to confront these internalized attitudes within themselves. And then importantly, they need to confront them in society and with policymakers. And there have been some very innovative ways of doing this. In Belo Horizonte, Brazil, there's a very progressive municipal waste management department that more than 20 years ago formed a social mobilization unit. They realized that waste isn't just a technical issue, it's a social, cultural, political, and economic issue as well. And so instead of having a waste management department staffed solely by technicians and engineers, they hired sociologists, anthropologists, social workers, who began a program to work with the collectors of recyclable materials. And they began things such as waste and citizenship forums in Belo Horizonte and at state and national level in Brazil, where they bring together people who do this work with residents in order to educate the resident.
I think this challenges our own attitude towards waste, because often it's something that we don't want to deal with. But if we can see the new industries that come out of it, the innovation, the creativity, it also serves as not just validating the reclaimers or the waste pickers, but educating societies, the producers of waste themselves.
Absolutely, and I like the fact that you're talking about changing our own attitudes, because really I find it quite ironic that we as residents discriminate against the people who go through the rubbish, and we're repulsed that they will go through our waste instead of being repulsed with ourselves for producing so much waste.
With Africa being a continent that has the most poverty, the highest levels of unemployment, are we exploring this area of work enough? Are we doing enough to make them part of the mainstream economy and also create opportunities for those who are unemployed?
Historically, as governments and municipalities in Africa have begun to try to adopt formal recycling programs, they've looked to the Netherlands, they've looked to advanced European economies and have tried to import models from there. And these have proven to be completely inappropriate socially and in terms of achieving recycling goals. So for example, in Cairo, which had one of the highest recycling rates in the world, it was reaching 80%, completely through the work of informal Zabaleen waste collectors. When the municipality finally decided to adopt a formal recycling program, instead of creating contracts with the people who were already doing the work and had been doing so for decades, they gave contracts to private companies. And whereas the recycling rate was around 80%, they only required the private companies to recycle 20% of the waste. And these companies were then completely incapable of actually providing the service because they were working in a way that was at odds with a system that already existed.
Sure, I think we're all challenged. I'm feeling very challenged at the moment. I'm never going to look at waste in the same way. And there is our next guest who doesn't look at waste the same way. My next guest, Jason Drew, describes himself as an environmental capitalist. He's found a way to turn organic waste into high-protein feed for animals. His company, AgriProtein, won the African Prize for Innovation for their outstanding work in reinventing waste. Take a look at this.